Well, after watching this eye-opening video about the situation for Copts in Egypt, we're starting with our fourth panel for today, titled Practical Solutions for Achieving Equal Citizenship Rights for Egypt's Copts, moderated by Lindsay Rodriguez, Director of Development and Advocacy at Coptic Solidarity.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. I'm really excited about this panel because this is kind of the heart of what I enjoy most about my work with Coptic Solidarity, is doing the advocacy work and trying to find new creative ways to be more effective, to collaborate better. And I think that we're going to have an excellent panel because we have a lot of expertise here. I think I'll just introduce each speaker right before they speak, and we'll just kind of go down the line here. A reminder, if you have questions, we have some cards. They're in the back. You can write down any questions you have, and somebody will collect those and bring them up to me so that I can ask those in the Q&A time. Our first speaker is the president of Coptic Solidarity, Carolyn Doss. Carolyn's an immigration attorney. She works with a lot of Coptic immigrants and as well as a lot of other Egyptians. She has been serving as the president of Coptic Solidarity since 2019. She is one of the founding members of Coptic Solidarity and has testified in Congress several times on behalf of the organization, talking about trafficking of Coptic women and girls and a variety of other issues. So with that, let's welcome Carolyn.
Hi, everyone. So today's panel is about practical solutions. I think, this is the way I look at it, that the government is mainly responsible. Can everybody hear me back there? Oh, that's better. Okay. All right. I think that the government should be responsible and play a leading role in the practical solutions. When I think of the government, I think of like the mom and dad. Like they're in charge, you know, and the society are the kids. They set the rules, they set the tones, the do's, the don'ts. It's their job. It's their role. I think we need to start with basics. Acknowledgement. The government needs to actually acknowledge. But the problem is when you acknowledge, it means you have to take action. I think education is extremely important. The education system in Egypt basically removes anything about Coptic history and Coptic identity. That is also very important. We need to change the laws, like we spoke about earlier. We need to apply the laws that we have. Something that Coptic Solidarity has been working on is promoting affirmative action. That's very important. Affirmative action. Earlier in the day, we spoke about the new numbers for judgeships and high positions in Egypt, and we saw that Christians were capped at basically the max is 2%, 0 to 2% for all prestigious positions in universities, in the judicial system, and we need to get affirmative action to support that equalization where Copts will get at least 10 to 15% of those positions. In the judicial system, the parliament, police, state security, public universities, and sports. Now, how do we make that happen? I think we had some really great panelists today, and a lot of them touched upon the different ideas. I think Frank Wolf was the one talking about the $1 billion. We give them $1 billion a year. Certainly there must be some sort of leverage that we can gain through that $1 billion that we grant Egypt every year. Diplomatic intervention, someone had mentioned that earlier. Use this as a tool, but find someone that can speak the language of the people that we're dealing with, because as I think Mr. Ibrahim mentioned earlier, this is a tribal mentality. The UN platform, you know, what was amazing is that we were able to get that status recently, and we use that now as an opportunity to connect and get more attention to our issue and connect with other countries. And then something else that I think is really important and does seem really challenging, but spotlighting individual cases, like the Baby Shnuda case. we stuck to that and we didn't give up until baby Shuna came out of that orphanage. The Rami Camel case, we stuck to that and didn't let that go until Camel came out of detention. So attention, that's very practical. It's difficult, but it's practical. Attention to individual cases will probably generate some sort of movement, because when there isn't any attention, education, then the problem continues to fester and grow. And then I think really importantly, and that's something else that we've been working on, is calling out the Egyptian government on their propaganda / smoke screen and educating the public on what's actually really happening out there. If people continue to believe in the smoke screen and the propaganda, we'll never see anything change. But those are my suggestions.
Thank you, Carolyn. I would also add that Coptic Solidarity has written quite a few reports with recommendations, and that's something that maybe we could put together after this panel when we compile the recommendations from our panelists as well as ours, and it'll certainly help inform our work. Our next speaker is David Schenker, who is the Taub Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Rubin Family Arab Politics Program. He actually, for many of you probably remember, he spoke at one of our events several years back. In the meantime, more recently, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs all the way through January 2021. And in that capacity, he was the principal Middle East advisor to the Secretary of State and senior officials overseeing the conduct of U.S. policy and diplomacy in a region stretching from Morocco to Iran to Yemen. So with that, let's welcome David. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, when asked to speak about practical solutions, I am, having worked on the Middle East for decades, I think a pessimist by nature. And with Egypt in particular, it's incredibly difficult to solve because, as Carolyn said, this is all about government policy. And Egypt has proven through the decades to be almost impervious to outside pressure, whether trying to leverage billions of dollars. I can tell you when I was in government working for Secretary Pompeo, there were 3 wrongly detained Americans in Egypt, and we tried to get them out. And I spoke to them about it. Secretary of State spoke to the government of Egypt about it. Vice President Pence spoke to Egypt about it, and they didn't budge, and essentially killed 1 American out of 3 who was in prison. And this just highlights the difficulty of your problem, getting Egypt, that is so dug in, the government of Egypt, to make what are, I think, necessary, but not enormous changes, some very small but meaningful changes. I can talk about it. I prepared remarks. I'm going to try and keep it short. You know, people look at Egypt now. Even the Baba, right, has said that things are great under President Sisi. Look how much things have improved. He's accomplished in 7 years what would have taken a normal person 30 years to accomplish. Let's compare him to Mubarak and Sadat and Nasser, and aren't things great for the Coptic Christian community? And you look at the representation in parliament, you now have 6% or 6.1%, up from, something like under Nasser, 1.7%, or Sadat, 3%, Mubarak, 1.6%. It's a lot, relatively speaking, but it's woefully inadequate to what the percentage of the population is. They have new church laws. They're better than they were. You've had approval to repair almost 2,000 churches out of a total of 5,500 that you've requested. Once again, necessary but inadequate. And given the pace of bureaucracy in Egypt, it's unlikely to move forward quickly enough. Even with all these, I mean, we all know that you still have all host of problems, the taxes that you pay for mosques, that for Islamic schools, clergy, and no reciprocity for churches or to underwrite your own institutions. Socioeconomic mobility, we saw it on the board, job discrimination in governance and security fields and all sorts of fields. This is because, obviously, the continued and preeminent role of Islam as a state religion, and it has an impact on marriage, personal status, inheritance, as we heard from Carolyn, also adoption and other legal processes. And the repressive nature of the government makes it almost impossible to complain about it. So there's a tradition of impunity, of course, right? Nobody goes to prison for their crimes against Copts, and the government tries to broker mediations and all these things. But there's also, if you complain about it, you're accused of fomenting sectarian strife, right? Which you can go to jail for. Article 86 prohibits I think the damaging of national unity and social peace. This is also. So it's risky to discuss these kind of matters in Egypt. But to be fair, this pertains to all Egyptians. You cannot talk about injustice in Egypt, right? Whether it's perpetrated against the Coptic community or others. Now, I think civil society is important and can play a role in helping to advance the cause, advance the cause of the need for tolerance. But once again, these are also highly sensitive issues that are, I think, constrained by the security apparatus. It might be helpful over time, I think, to change the school curricula to highlight the role that various civilizations, including the Coptic community, have played, and the relationship of Egyptian minorities to Egyptian society. I think what is useful is what you have put forward in terms of practical solutions. I mean, the Copts themselves have put forward 10 or more things that are helpful. I'll highlight a couple. Advocating for the amendment to the personal status law, which does not and which should not differentiate between Copts and Muslims in Egypt. The inclusion of Coptic history in the education curriculum. This may be a bridge too far, but the abrogation of Islam as a state religion of Egypt. Removing the religion field and identity cards, right? It makes it harder to prejudice against job applicants. We all know that all media in Egypt is official media, so ending discrimination in the media, right? This is not about freedom of expression, right? There is no freedom of expression in Egypt, right? These are government publications. Greater representation in political life. There are quotas. They're necessary but insufficient. And the freedom to convert. So I think it's difficult, going back to where I started, I think it's difficult to imagine the government of Egypt getting to where it needs to go, given how dug in it has been on so many other topics. And this is an important issue of human rights. But if Copts, who are integral, indigenous, and a critical element in Egypt's history, culture, and social fabric, are to remain in Egypt, there has to be progress toward these elements of equal citizenship. And there's no silver bullet from the U.S. government in that regard, regrettably. Thank you.
Thank you. That raises a whole lot more questions in my mind of things that hopefully we'll have time to discuss. Our next panelist actually joined us for an Egypt coordinator at the U.S. State Department. So we have two people here with experience working at the State Department. And one last thing I would add as well is that the only report that I have seen that looked into the implementation of the 2016 church law was led by Amy's team at POMED. And that was one of the most helpful reports I think that we've seen. So with that, let's welcome Amy.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you to Coptic Solidarity for inviting me back. I had a great time last fall, and I'm so pleased to be back with all of you. And Lindsay has been a really important partner for my work and my organization's work for many years. You know, I'm going to underscore and maybe repeat and emphasize several of the same themes that Caroline and David also raised. I have a feeling that we on this panel are like-minded on these issues. But just to state at the outset, you know, this issue is incredibly important. It is, of course, a religious freedom issue. It is a issue of justice. It is an issue of equal citizenship. And we all know that the Christian community, the indigenous Christian community in Egypt, is one of the most important in the world. And what happens to Egypt's Christians is, you know, a bellwether for trends in the broader North Africa and Middle East region in terms of tolerance or intolerance. So it's very important for Egypt, but also for the broader region. So the cause is just, but as my colleagues have mentioned, it is so hard to make progress on this issue. As David said, and I've had my own many years of experience with this, the Egyptian government, Egyptian officialdom is extremely resistant and incredibly defensive, and on many of the issues relating to religious freedom in Egypt, they don't even actually acknowledge that the problem exists. In rare cases where they do acknowledge that the problem exists, they tend to, in my experience, minimize it, distort it, or sort of create confusion by claiming more sort of progress or improvement on the issue than actually exists. Also, as David said, you know, we have to keep in mind that Egypt is under its current and former regimes is a very repressive government. So this is a situation where nobody in Egypt, no Egyptian, regardless of her faith, has protected human rights, legitimate, universally respected and acknowledged human rights and political freedoms. So the overall environment is very difficult for Egyptians themselves to fight on these issues, along with a host of other interconnected and related human rights issues. We also know that Egypt does continue to have an important geopolitical status because of its location, its geographic location, and its peace treaty with Israel, and its cooperation with Western governments on things like counterterrorism. That geopolitical status, Egypt's government often uses fairly effectively on the world stage, and they are able to use that as a way of dismissing or minimizing these criticisms of their record when it comes to religious freedom and the rights of Egypt's different faith communities. So it's very difficult. As we know, there's also a debate among experts and historians and analysts about how human rights changes actually take place, lasting changes take place in any society. Is it a bottom-up process by which individual and community attitudes change at the grassroots and greater tolerance and acceptance is spread, and then this kind of moves up and eventually affects government laws and practices? Or, on the other hand, does change start with the government, with the state, changing its laws and practices, and then that sets in motion a number of other changes? You know, in reality, it's both, and they interact together in complicated ways. But I agree with David that and Caroline that the Egyptian government is a key interlocutor. I mean, they represent the state, and the Egyptian government has its own laws its own constitution and is a signatory to important international human rights treaties and instruments. So it has the obligation, the Egyptian government has the obligation to uphold rights and freedoms for all of its citizens. So, what could be done when we talk about practical steps to improve this situation? Well, as my colleagues have said, there's a number of things, practical steps when it comes to changing laws, just the legal framework that, in my view, and I believe I said this at your October conference as well, President Assisi could make these changes in 3 to 5 minutes this evening, if he had the political will to do so. This is really a question of political will. He could, of course, call for improvements to the church construction law, whether that's improving the existing legislation, which is inherently unjust against non-Muslims in terms of ability to worship and practice one's faith, or he could propose a universal worship law. I mean, there's a number of things that could be done in different steps, but this is a question of improving the legal structure. He, of course, also could call for a change to remove the blasphemy language from the penal code, which we all know is terribly abused, especially against Christian citizens of Egypt. That is something that I think if just that one clause in the penal code were changed or removed, that would immediately have a very, very, very positive effect on rights and on the environment in Egypt. Of course, there are things relating to the personal status law. There's also the question, as my colleagues have said, of accountability, justice for those in Egypt who have violated the rights of their fellow citizens who are Egyptian Christians, accountability for violence, for attack on churches. If there's the political will to prosecute those people and hold them accountable, that would also make a really, I think, big difference. Other things like educational reform, media freedom, civil society freedom. The most important thing here is we know for lasting changes, this has to be led by Egyptians inside Egypt. So all of these interconnected freedoms, political freedoms, civil society freedoms, media freedoms, those are all freedoms, if they were expanded and respected, that Egyptians themselves would have more protected space to talk honestly about these problems and call for solutions. Instead of being punished like, for example, Patrick Zeki, who wrote a very honest assessment of what was happening in Egypt with the Coptic Christian community and was, promptly arrested upon his return to Egypt from study in Italy. He is no longer in detention. He was released from pretrial detention, but the case against him is ongoing. This is also something that the Egyptian government could do at the snap of a finger, is drop the charges against him and others like him. So while Egyptians have to lead, and any lasting and real change has to be driven and led by Egyptians inside the country, because of the situation inside Egypt and the repression, it is crucial. Governments, NGOs, individuals outside of Egypt have an essential role to play in raising these issues, talking about them, promoting greater awareness, work like Coptic Solidarity does and other organizations. I personally believe that there's more for the US government to do in this regard, talking publicly about these issues and calling attention to them as an area for improvement. Egypt is not the only country in the world that faces these challenges, but they certainly do have a long way to go. So I think there's actually a lot more room for example, for the US government, while in this strategic partnership with Egypt, to raise these issues and to legitimize the concerns that Egyptians themselves have about these problems. So I guess I'll close by saying that I think this is a difficult moment in Egypt. As all of you know, the economy is really going through a very, very, very difficult time. And I personally worry that as in most countries, when the economy deteriorates, that tears at the social fabric and makes intercommunal and just citizen-to-citizen relations in general more difficult as people are really suffering from their economic situation. So this is a difficult moment in Egypt. But just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, if President Sisi genuinely wanted to take just any of these steps to improve the situation, he could, make it happen in the blink of an eye. So we are waiting to see that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Our last panelist is Dr. Nathan J. Brown, who is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. He teaches courses on Middle Eastern politics, as well as more general courses on comparative politics and international relations. In addition to his academic work, he also serves on the Board of Trustees at the American University in Cairo and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Thank you very much. I'm distinct from my other panelists because I can't say it's good to be back because I've never been here before. And it's also distinct, I'm also going to be a little bit distinctive. David Schenker began by saying, essentially, how can I give practical steps when I'm so pessimistic? I think, how can I give practical steps when I'm just a pure academic? My contributions will be nerdy rather than practical. But I'll try to turn them towards the practical realm. My area of expertise, such as it is a little bit of sort of on legal and constitutional frameworks. And there is, over the last century or so, a fairly robust internationalization of talk about human rights, right? You have rights because you're human, not because you're a member of a particular political community. A universal declaration of human rights, about ideas of religious freedom and so on. But how these ideas are understood and processed within each political system is very, very different. The kinds of debates we have about religious freedom here are different from the ones in Egypt. So I thought I'd begin simply by saying that there has been robust debate about the place of religion in the Egyptian political system and about religious freedom. But I think the effective constitutional language, the way that I would translate it into English very, very loosely goes something like this. You can believe whatever you want in your heart. When it comes to public exercise of religion, pick one from the following approved list and do not change your mind. It doesn't say it in those words, but effectively that's what the religious provisions mean. And it has certain effects. Oh. It has, this is too much. Is this okay? All right, okay. If it's too loud, now it sounds too loud to me, but if it's too loud, just go like this and I'll figure out. It has certain effects. Essentially, an awful lot of the public political argumentation about religion in Egypt, in the Egyptian legal and constitutional order, and in constitutional deliberations, have been essentially communal rights, right? The Constitution will sometimes use the term freedom of aqidah, of creed, meaning not believe whatever, not individual belief, but essentially you can belong to one of these subscribed, recognized faiths, and there's a number of recognized faiths. And so a lot of the controversy does focus on things like personal status law, church construction, and so on. And the effect is that there are certain things that get overlooked, and that's where I wanted to turn a little bit practical. So what sort of things get overlooked when you take that kind of approach, that religion is essentially a communal matter, and religious freedom has to be negotiated with individual communities? What happens when you start taking a look at Egyptian Christians as Egyptian citizens first? And I've heard some Egyptian Christians say, look, we're Copts on Sunday, but what about every other day of the week when we are Egyptian citizens? What happens when you start talking in that way? Number one, you start thinking a little bit more in terms of individual rights. And we've heard some of that from the co-panelists, right to convert, for instance. there's no provision preventing you from converting. It's just if you try, the system cannot handle it or will not handle it. It will not recognize it. So any idea of individual rights or blasphemy, you have an individual right to expression. No, what the system is essentially doing is protecting organized religions. You cannot blaspheme Islam because Islam is the official religion. There's no individual freedom of expression there, no understanding that what might constitute blasphemy in the eyes of some would not be blasphemy in the eyes of others. A second, discrimination, and it's really interesting to me that this panel has discrimination in the title because it's not the way that it is usually publicly discussed. And that the video actually highlighted this issue, and to me it's interesting and something to press. And here I would draw a contrast. Right? American constitutional provisions on religion are actually very, very limited, and it's not quite clear what they mean. The Egyptian Constitution actually has an awful lot more, but anti-discrimination law is very well established in American legal practice. It's statute law, it's practice, it's regulation. It's not constitutional. It may be based on constitutional, but the constitutional language is very, very weak. The Egyptian situation is exactly the opposite. There's a clear bar to discrimination on the basis of religion, and there's absolutely no real enforcement, right? So there is a tension sometimes at the senior level. The the Chief Justice of the Supreme Constitutional Court is now a Christian. But walk into an Egyptian embassy, walk into an Egyptian police station, go into an officers club for the military, and ask, how many Christians are there? And they aren't there. It's not legal, it's not recognized. There are just Christian-free zones throughout the Egyptian state bureaucracy. And so focusing on discrimination, not necessarily legal protections, but actual practice, who gets hired, and who is represented in these institutions is something to focus on. And the third thing is this, I think this is implicit in both what David said and Amy said, and in a sense, I think what Carolyn said, is the securitization of the entire issue, right? When you deal with Egyptian officials, they will often understand this as, this is about social peace, this is about communal tensions. We cannot talk about this. It's an embarrassing family problem that just is better left unsaid. If you talk about it, if you talk about these cases, you will be endangering social peace. You will be setting off communal tensions in neighborhoods and villages and the site and this sort of thing. So let us simply certainly not talk about it internationally. You're an enemy of Egypt if you talk about it internationally, and even domestically. If you talk to Egyptians, there's all kinds of talk about it. If you talk to Egyptians, if you pick up an Egyptian newspaper, you wouldn't hear anything about it. And I think the discrimination and the securitization actually have something to do with each other, because when this is viewed essentially as a security matter, it's being handled by officials who are operating in one of those Christian-free zones. They understand the issues that way. Whatever their own personal beliefs, they may be free of individual prejudice, they're still understanding it primarily from a milieu which does not involve an awful lot of Christians. And so the issue of accountability that Amy talked about is simply absent in a situation in which there is no public discourse permissible. So pushing essentially this to be understood as a matter of discrimination and of social practice rather than of national security, and trying to recast discussion in those terms, I think might be healthier, in a sense, lowering the temperature, but also making it much more possible to talk about practical steps that could be taken. So that's the best that I can do for practical steps, but I hope it's useful in setting off some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to interact a little bit with some of the statements that have been made. If you do have questions, please raise your hand to get a card, and somebody will bring you one. I think the first question that I have is, you were saying that Egypt seems impervious to outside pressure, going all the way up to the vice president asking for the release of the prisoner. And I remember well the case of the American who died while in prison. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
The one thing that a lot of human rights groups that work on Egypt seem to agree that is probably the most useful is withholding of U.S. foreign aid, making that condition. But every single year, the State Department gives the national security waiver when the majority of that aid goes. So kind of looking at that, and then also tying in the annual reporting, which most people look at, the annual IRF report on Egypt as well as the USIRF report. We see a lot of repetition of what I would call kind of cosmetic changes, such as we built the largest cathedral in the Middle East. Never mind that it's really far away. You have to get a permit to attend it, and it doesn't address at all the existing need for churches. That type of thing that gets reported. So, how does that all tie together in terms of how we could apply pressure if there was one point, that could kind of get through that impervious barrier?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've had this discussion, I think, with Amy many times. Also with one of our former colleagues, Michelle Dunn, about how best to leverage U.S. foreign assistance. Now, maybe I'll be corrected here by Amy, who probably knows more about or has forgotten more about Egypt than I ever knew. But there's only one case to my particular mind where a direct link between Egyptian behavior and a sum of U.S. dollars was ever made directly that worked. And that's during the Bush administration, in the case of Saadettin Ibrahim, who was a civil society, pro-democracy activist, who was a dual Egyptian-U.S. national, and who was imprisoned for saying something, doing something, how people are imprisoned in Egypt. And the Bush administration said, if you don't let this guy out of jail, we will withhold, I don't know, 180 or $200 million. And the Mubarak government at the time said, we will not bow to American pressure. And then 3 weeks later, he was out of jail, or maybe 3 months. But I don't recall another incident such as that. And I think when you look at U.S. policymakers in the executive branch versus the Congress, I think Congress is, has to deal less with the repercussions of the brief, what I think oftentimes is meddling in foreign policy, right? Foreign policy is the preserve of the executive. The legislature can play a role. It oftentimes is legislating, is setting a sanction or trying to restrict the executive by conditioning funds. But the problem is with Egypt in particular is that what is $1.3 billion, what is that today versus what it was 30 years ago, right? 1979, let's say 1980. It was a lot back then when it was $2 billion. And now it's 1.3 and is really, I think, relatively less and objectively less significant. And if you cut it, what does it do? What does it open up the potential? Well, the main priority for every U.S. administration now, and let's put aside the fact that the Biden administration is a human rights administration. I put the air quotes around that. But the main priority for every administration going forward is great power competition, in particular vis-a-vis China. That is pushing back on China, wanting to maintain relationships, not wanting to get pushed out or competing with countries for strategic relationships that are not impinged on by China, which we consider just a terrible actor and would remove all U.S. leverage in certain potential worst case scenarios. And so, there's a concern with Egypt that if you cut all funding, if you cut all sort of ties, that Egypt will look elsewhere. And this wouldn't be unprecedented for Egypt. Think back 1973, right? Egypt wasn't always aligned with the United States. They did a really dramatic turn in a very short period of time, went from the Soviet Union to the United States. So I think that's in the back of the minds here. And whether they're going to risk it all on the treatment of Copts in Egypt. I just don't think it's likely that any administration would do that. Amy, am I wrong? Yeah, no, it's basically all military assistance now, but nonetheless, the Egyptian military loves its toys.
Sure. So I agree with what a lot of my friend David said, but I guess I may be, well, I don't know if optimistic is the right word, but I have seen a number of cases or situations where the U.S. government has used military aid as a lever to get progress on specific human rights cases. And in a number of cases, the U.S. actually has been successful. There's a number of challenges, though. One of them being is that, as David referred to, U.S. leverage in the form of our military aid is frankly not as significant as it was, or our potential leverage, as it was 2 or 3 decades ago when the world looked different, the Middle East looked different, and the $1.3 billion of military aid that we provide to Egypt every year was worth more in the Egyptian economy than it is today. That's a challenge. The other challenge is that, Egyptian diplomats and government officials are, I think, either famously or notoriously, depending on your point of view, very, very tough to deal with on these issues. It really takes a lot of pressure, effort, consistent raising of issues, and usually, in my experience, the withholding of something that Egypt wants to get progress on individual human rights cases. That's what we're talking about for the past many years, not, systemic change, far from it. Having a small number of wrongfully detained people, U.S. citizens in some cases, and others only Egyptian citizens, released from horrible, horrific prison conditions. So it takes a lot of effort, jawboning, strong arming. It often does take involvement of very senior U.S. officials who have a lot of other issues to engage on Egypt with. This is just one of many U.S. interests. But I guess maybe I'm a little more positive than David in the sense that I have seen this kind of linkage or pressure work. In the past couple of years, the Biden administration has actually withheld and reprogrammed a chunk, not a large chunk, but about $100-ish million of military aid to Egypt because of human rights cases. And of course, the Egyptian government will never acknowledge that there's a link with this, but we also we have seen a number of political prisoners, political detainees released in the past couple of years. Now, this is a very small number who have been released. There's very, very important and people and tens of thousands of people who are still unjustly detained in Egypt. And while on the one hand, the Sisi regime has released some prisoners who have gotten a lot of international attention, they continue to arrest new people every day. So actually more people are going into prison than going out. But I am still of the view that even, especially with American citizens or dual citizens being the first priority, but also for Egyptians who were unjustly detained, it's still worth the effort for the U.S. to use its influence to get these people out of prison. And just to get a few people released, as I said, it takes playing serious hardball with the Egyptian government. Stamina, consistency, pressure, it takes all those things, and it's very, very difficult. And the Egyptian side often succeeds in, weighing down the American side. But I have seen more, minimal, small, inadequate, but nonetheless some successes that I've seen for much more than I've seen on the European side. I haven't seen European diplomacy really get as many prisoners out of Egypt. So we're talking about very incremental, small scale, individual level cases here. I know that the Biden administration is very aware of the case of Patrick Zaki. That's just one of many people who has been, unjustly prosecuted, basically because he wrote the truth about the situation of Copts in Egypt. So I know that they do raise these issues, and the Trump administration did as well, as David said. But it's a real challenge because of the great power competition lens through which so much of U.S. foreign policy is taking place these days, and also because there are so many other issues on the agenda with U.S.-Egypt relations that this can only ever be, one of the issues that the U.S. presses on. But I'm here to say that I think the U.S. can be successful when it really pushes hard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those responses. We have a few more questions. We'll get through as many as we can. One actually mentions something that I had also written down to ask about. Basically, the person is making a comment about how the government prefers to deal with Copts as a group, and it's easier to deal with, let's say, the Coptic Pope as the power broker who makes all decisions for Copts, as opposed to listening to individual Copts. You could say the same for, Catholic or Protestant churches, and for other religious minorities. So tying that in as well to something that Amy had said, which is that any real change has to be led by Christians in Egypt themselves. What are they to do if they don't have a voice? Because basically, we'll say the church broadly, whichever church that happens to be, basically is the power broker. How do Copts raise their own issues and kind of have more autonomy, I guess you could say? And that's for anybody who wants to answer.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into this, but what I said earlier, when I noted how the Pope had spoken so admiringly of President Sisi and how great things are for the Coptic community under Sisi. This is the leader of your community, and of course, President Sisi would prefer to deal with somebody who thinks that he is the best thing since sliced bread. It's difficult. This is intercommunal stuff. I can't tell you how to handle your community, but it's hard to break out of this mold. Obviously, there are institutional. It tends towards this in Egypt, right? There's a woman. What's her name? Magda, right? The head of the Jewish community in Egypt, right? All 12 of them, and this woman Magda, hates Israel, right? And so she is the representative, the acceptable representative of the Jewish community in Egypt, because she's right on target on this main issue, and so it's okay for the president Sisi to associate with her. And so this is let's just say it's complicated.
Can I, situation with the Copts, there's more than 12. By the way, I think they're down to about 8. So, just give two kind of actual hopeful developments, and these are long-term rather than short-term. But number one is, I mentioned when I was talking, and David was talking, and Amy, about just how there is no freedom of expression in Egypt when it comes to public speech, when it comes to newspapers and broadcast. One recent change I've just seen over the last year or so is, in terms of discussions and what I've seen on social media, is just much, much freer. So this is a place where there are places where you can have discussions that don't go through official circles. They're not linked up to politics, right? They're not linked up to political parties or political activities. But the second thing that has happened, I think, and this is a generational change in Egypt, I've been going to Egypt off and on, well, for more years than I want to count, that I can count in my head. But it is a different country now in terms of interaction with the outside world. Egyptians tend to be much more sophisticated, much more clued in. A lot of this is internet driven with discussions overseas. So maintaining ties to community in Egypt, I think, is actually very powerful. What is said about Egypt outside the country and what is said about Egypt inside the country are not as hermetically sealed as they used to be. So that doesn't lead to any solution. I'm just talking about discussing. But those kinds of discussions are more transnational and more free as long as you go outside of official channels. The official channels is still the president and the Pope, but there's a lot going on outside of that that just needs to be kept alive.
I think that's it's actually a really good question. It's a question we ask ourselves all the time because when your religious leader has one position and then we have another, what do you do? So I think we have to rely on organizations like Coptic Solidarity and other organizations that speak for the Christians in Egypt, and utilizing all these tools that we just spoke about, education and targeting specific cases and pressure through the U.S. government, United Nations, networking. That's really what it comes down to. It's just a lot of work coming through from organizations that are representing the interests of the minority in Egypt. If they could be inside Egypt, that would be even better, but I think that's the high risk, very high risk, but that's really the only way I think you'll get an accurate representation of the rights of the minority.
Okay. Another question that we got is basically talking about the role of YouTube and probably also social media, how there are religious merchants from Al-Azhar who use media such as YouTube to incite against the Copts of Egypt. The question is, does YouTube have a role in increasing the problems of the Copts and how to address that? And I would also, real quick, I'll add to that it's interesting because there are these social media discussions happening, but there's also such close monitoring by the Egyptian government that often people can be imprisoned off of messages that they received, even if the phone wasn't in their possession, or the atheist guy who ran a Facebook page who was imprisoned for that. So I'll leave that for you guys.
I think that's an awesome question. I don't have much experience with the YouTube, but I have had many clients show me Facebook posts that basically curse out Christians and incite violence against Christians. And when you compare that to like the censorship that we see here in Facebook, and we've heard of people that advocate for certain things, and next thing you know, Facebook suspends their account. How sensitive they are to some opinions, but then how they let others that incite violence completely run free. So that could be a campaign that we could, think about one day in the future, focusing on holding these social media platforms more accountable for the content that they allow people to post, especially if it incites violence. That's a very good thing to think about in the future, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, social media can be used for good or it can be used for evil. We've seen it, right? That unifies people, brings people together, and incites violence. It's all of these things at once. And you got to be on top of it, right? To get somebody banned from Facebook or from Twitter or from YouTube, somebody's got to report them. They've got to follow up on it, go out, present the evidence, and then go out and dog Google or Twitter or Facebook. And it's a full-time job to do this. And so, I think this would be useful, but it's not, it's not the answer, right? It's something that has to be done. It's necessary, but insufficient. There's going to be haters out there.
I would add just one other thing about social media. The International Religious Freedom Roundtable group actually has now an open channel with somebody from Facebook, Meta, because so many of the activists, and I see people in this room who I know have had their accounts taken down, Faith, for posting a picture of the martyrs, the Coptic martyrs in the orange jumpsuits. She had her account suspended. Yeah, and there's, I see other people here who I know have had those issues, but we do know that the Egyptian government has their, I guess you could call it their social media police who, are very actively tagging people and reporting. So that tends to be a problem. So I have a question here specifically for Dr. Brown. It says, you said that the U.S. Constitution doesn't state anti-discrimination laws, but it's in the regulations. How about the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and 14th Amendment? Thank you.
Well, very briefly, this is about the United States, which is not my area of expertise. I just live here. But what I would say is that what the First Amendment says is that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or inhibiting the free exercise thereof. It doesn't say anything about discrimination, and it also doesn't say anything about states establishing religions. That really, then you have the 14th Amendment. It's not really until the 20th century that the First Amendment gets understood the way it is today, as preventing any kind of government establishment of religion. And in terms of discrimination, it's not mentioned in the 14th Amendment. It's not really until you got legislation and practice in the 20th century. That's my understanding. But as I say, I probably know Egyptian constitutional law better than I know American constitutional law. So, and my suspicion is that we've even got an attorney sitting right out here on this panel, so you could probably get more educated answers from other people in the room.
Well, yeah, thank you all. I think just to wrap up, I would like to offer the opportunity if any of the panelists would like to comment on anything that we've discussed. If you have any closing remarks you'd like to make, you can do that now. No?
Just a closing comment to thank Coptic Solidarity for inviting us to be here today and to talk about these issues. And I and many other people hope that all the political prisoners in Egypt, including Coptic Egyptians and Egyptians of other faith backgrounds, will be released. There's a lot of people suffering in Egyptian prison, and the numbers continue to grow, and we hope that they will all be freed. Thank you.
All right, well, that concludes our session. Thanks so much, everyone.